A millionaire invited a beggar widow and her daughter to his luxury party to humiliate them. Minutes later, they took the microphone, and what they revealed left all the guests in shock. The night fell over the big city like a cold and merciless cloak, bringing with it the cutting wind that swept through the deserted streets of the commercial center. Under the faded marquee of a closed department store, two figures huddled against the cold, sharing a thin and torn blanket that barely covered their trembling bodies. Margaret held her daughter Lily tightly, trying to transfer to the girl all the heat that her own body could produce, although she knew it wasn't enough. Margaret's eyes remained open in the darkness, vigilant as she observed each shadow that passed by the sidewalk, each noise that echoed in the silent night. Her body ached with fatigue. Her bones seemed to weigh tons, but she couldn't sleep, not when she needed to protect her daughter from all the dangers that the street offered. Margaret's stomach growled with hunger, but she ignored the sensation just as she had for days, focusing only on keeping Lily safe and warm. "Mom, I'm cold," whispered Lily, her weak and trembling voice breaking the silence of the night. Margaret felt her heart tighten in her chest, a physical pain that was worse than any hunger or cold she herself could feel. Margaret pulled her daughter even closer, wrapping her completely in her thin arms, trying to create a human barrier against the icy wind that insisted on finding gaps in the old blanket. She kissed Lily's forehead and felt the excessive heat of the girl's skin, that heat that wasn't natural, that indicated fever. Lily's dark hair was tangled and dirty, stuck to her sweaty forehead despite the cold, and Margaret brushed it away with trembling fingers, caressing her daughter's head as she used to do when they still had a home, when there was still comfort and security in their lives. Margaret was 35 but looked 50, her face marked by the pain and suffering of the last 2 years living on the streets. Her brown eyes, which once were bright and full of hope, now carried a deep sadness, an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. Her clothes were a mixture of donated pieces and those found in the trash, all worn and stained. But she kept everything as clean as possible, washing the pieces whenever she found a public tap. "It will pass, my daughter, I promise it will pass," murmured Margaret, her voice choked with emotion that she struggled to control. She couldn't cry, not in front of Lily, not when the girl needed to believe that everything would be all right. Lily began to cough, a dry, hoarse cough that shook her small and fragile body, as if it would tear her from her mother's arms. Margaret sat up completely, supporting Lily against her chest, patting the girl's back lightly as the cough continued, persistent and painful. Each cough seemed to tear Lily's chest, and Margaret could hear the wheezing in her daughter's lungs, that frightening sound that had become more frequent in recent days. Lily's eyes watered with the effort of coughing, and she clung to her mother's torn blouse with her thin little hands, seeking support and comfort. Lily was only 12, but life on the streets had robbed her of the innocence and joy that a child should have. Her round little face was pale and marked by deep, dark circles, her lips cracked from the cold and dehydration. She wore a pink wool coat that had once belonged to another child too big for her tiny body, full of pills and stains that wouldn't come out anymore. "Mom, it hurts in here," said Lily between coughs, placing her small hand over her chest, her dark eyes wide with fear and discomfort. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes, but blinked quickly to push them away, maintaining an expression of calm that was far from what she felt. "I know, love, I know it hurts," replied Margaret, her voice coming out firmer than she felt, continuing to caress Lily's back in circular and gentle movements. When the cough finally stopped, Lily lay down again, exhausted, her breathing coming in short and difficult pulls. Margaret laid her down carefully, adjusting the blanket around the girl's body, making sure that every inch was covered. She herself remained sitting, leaning against the cold wall of the store, keeping a hand on Lily's shoulder, feeling her daughter's irregular breathing going up and down. The clock of the nearby church struck 2 in the morning, and Margaret looked at the dark sky above them, where weak stars twinkled between the city lights. She thought about how much time had passed since she had looked at the stars with hope, since she had believed that life could be different. 2 years living on the streets had taught Margaret that hope was a luxury she couldn't afford to have, but still, deep in her heart, she prayed every night for a miracle to happen. "Please, God, protect my daughter," Margaret whispered into the cold night, her voice getting lost in the wind. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of all that pain, before opening them again and returning to her vigil. The hours passed slowly, each minute seeming like an eternity, until the first lights of dawn began to tint the sky with orange and pink hues. Margaret hadn't slept for a minute, her eyes burned with fatigue, but she forced herself to get up when she heard the first sounds of the city waking up. Stores began to open, people passed by hurriedly going to work, and she knew they needed to leave before some security guard or police officer sent them away, as happened every morning. Carefully not to wake Lily abruptly, Margaret touched the girl's shoulder, shaking her gently. Lily opened her eyes slowly, disoriented, and took a few seconds to remember where she was, reality falling on her like a bucket of cold water. She sat up with effort, her body sore from a poor night's sleep on the hard concrete floor, and started coughing again, that terrible cough that made Margaret want to scream in despair. "Come on, my daughter, we need to get up," said Margaret, helping Lily to stand, holding her firmly when the girl's legs faltered. Margaret folded the blanket with quick, practical movements, storing it in the worn cloth bag she carried, with all the belongings they owned in the world. "Today will be a better day, you'll see," Margaret lied, forcing a smile on her cracked lips. Lily just nodded, without strength to respond, leaning on her mother's arm as they walked along the sidewalk. They walked for 3 blocks until they reached the area of luxury stores, where buildings were taller and brighter, where windows displayed products that cost more than Margaret had earned in an entire year when she still had a job. It was there that they tried to get some coins, where people supposedly had money to spare and could have compassion for a homeless mother and daughter. Margaret knew that place well, knew every corner, every store, every security guard who worked there, and who looked at them with contempt and impatience. They positioned themselves in front of an expensive jewelry store, where executives and wealthy women usually passed by in the morning, and Margaret extended her hand, keeping her head down, feeling the humiliation burn in her cheeks with each person who passed, ignoring her presence. Lily stood beside her mother, quiet, her eyes fixed on the ground, too ashamed to look into the eyes of passing people. The first hours yielded only a few coins and many judgmental looks, people diverting their path to not pass near them, mothers pulling their children away as if poverty were contagious. "Please, any help? My daughter is sick," Margaret repeated to every person passing by, her voice increasingly weak, increasingly desperate. Most didn't even look, some made faces of disgust, and rare were those who stopped to deposit a few coins in her outstretched hand. A tall and strong security guard, dressed in an impeccable black uniform, approached them with heavy and determined steps, his expression hard and inflexible as stone. Margaret recognized the man. He was the same one who expelled them almost every day, the same one who seemed to take special pleasure in humiliating them. He stopped in front of Margaret, crossing his arms over his broad chest, looking down at her with evident contempt in his small, dark eyes. Lily cowered behind her mother, holding the hem of Margaret's coat tightly, her small body trembling not just from cold but from fear. Margaret raised her head and met the security guard's gaze, trying to maintain some dignity despite the degrading situation she found herself in. The man was about 40 years old, with grey hair cut close to his head, and a permanent expression of irritation on his red and swollen face. "You cannot stay here. How many times do I have to repeat that?" said the security guard, his loud and harsh voice cutting through the morning air like a sharp blade. Margaret felt anger boil inside her, but swallowed her pride once again as she did every day, because arguing with him would not help and would only make the situation worse. "We're just asking for help. We're not bothering anyone," replied Margaret, keeping her voice low and controlled, trying to sound reasonable and humble. She squeezed Lily's hand, who trembled behind her, trying to convey security to the girl, although she herself was afraid of what that man might do. The security guard took a step forward, invading Margaret's personal space, trying to intimidate her with his size and position. She could smell the coffee on his breath, could see the bulging veins in his thick neck, and knew he was about to lose his patience. People passed around them, some stopping to observe the scene, but no one intervening, no one caring enough to help. Margaret stood firm. She would not back down, not when she was trying to get enough to buy at least some cough medicine for Lily. "You are disturbing people," customers complain. "They say they feel sorry and it ruins their day," continued the security guard, his tone laden with cruel sarcasm. "Leave now or I'll call the police," he threatened, pointing to the end of the street with a thick, stained finger. Margaret felt tears threatening to fall, but blinked quickly, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. "All right, we're going," said Margaret, her voice coming out lower than she intended, almost a whisper of defeat. She bent down to pick up the bag she had left on the ground next to Lily, and at that moment the girl began to cough again, that violent cough that doubled her small body in half. Margaret immediately dropped the bag and held Lily, supporting her as the cough continued, each harsh and painful sound echoing on the busy street. The security guard took a step back, as if fearing the girl had something contagious, his expression changing from anger to discomfort. Some people stopped to observe, their faces showing a mixture of pity and disgust, but none offering real help, just empty stares that meant nothing. When the cough finally passed, Lily was as pale as wax, her body limp in Margaret's arms, who had to make an enormous effort to keep her standing. "She needs a doctor, she's very sick," said Margaret, her voice now desperate, looking around at the people watching, silently begging for help she knew wouldn't come. The security guard just pointed again to the end of the street, his face closed and inflexible, without a drop of compassion in his cold eyes. Margaret picked up the bag with one hand and held Lily with the other, walking away with slow and heavy steps, feeling the security guard's gaze burning on her back until they turned the corner. They walked for a few more blocks, passing by coffee shops where people ate expensive breakfasts, by clothing stores where mannequins displayed pieces that cost a fortune, by shop windows showing a world to which Margaret and Lily no longer belonged. With each step, Margaret felt the weight of defeat, humiliation, the absolute hopelessness that threatened to swallow her completely. Lily walked beside her mother in silence, her small hand clutching Margaret's, her breathing still difficult and wheezy. They stopped in front of an elegant cafe, where the smell of fresh bread and roasted coffee escaped through the door every time someone entered or left. Margaret watched through the window the people sitting comfortably, talking and laughing, without a care in the world, and felt a stab of envy so strong it almost made her double over in pain. "Mom, I'm hungry," said Lily, her voice weak and tired, breaking Margaret's reverie. Margaret looked at her daughter and saw the extreme paleness of her face, the cracked lips, the sunken and dull eyes, and felt her heart breaking into 1,000 pieces inside her chest. "I know, love, I am too," replied Margaret, squeezing Lily's hand affectionately, trying to convey comfort through that simple touch. She opened the bag and searched among the few belongings until she found the small tin where she kept the coins they managed to collect throughout the days. Her fingers trembled as she counted the coins, mentally adding up the ridiculously low amount they had managed to get that morning and in the previous days. It wasn't enough for a decent meal, barely enough for 2 simple loaves of bread, but it was all they had. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, making quick calculations in her head, trying to decide whether to buy food or medicine, knowing she couldn't have both. The choice was impossible, cruel, but it was the reality they faced every day. "Let's buy a bread to share, okay?" asked Margaret, putting the tin back in the bag, trying to sound excited although she was destroyed inside. Lily just nodded, too tired to argue or ask for more, too accustomed to the hunger that was her constant companion. Margaret took Lily's hand again, and they walked to a simpler bakery 2 streets ahead, where prices were more affordable. They were about to enter the bakery when a tall man dressed in an elegant dark grey suit stopped in front of them, blocking the way. Margaret looked up surprised, finding a face with fine features and a neutral, indecipherable expression. The man must have been around 50, black hair combed back with gel, a well-trimmed beard and light blue eyes that observed them with an intensity that made Margaret feel uncomfortable. He carried a brown leather briefcase under his arm and wore shoes so shiny that Margaret could see her own distorted reflection in them. There was something about that man that made her suspicious. Perhaps it was the way he looked at them, as if he were evaluating merchandise in a store, or perhaps it was simply the fact that well-dressed people never brought good news to people like them. Lily hid behind Margaret, only her large, frightened eyes appearing from behind her mother's worn coat. "Excuse me," said Margaret, trying to move past the man to enter the bakery, but he stepped to the side, blocking the path again. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine, her maternal instincts warning that something was wrong with that situation. "Margaret Collins?" asked the man, his voice soft and polite, almost gentle, but there was something behind it that sounded fake to Margaret. She froze upon hearing her full name, a name she hadn't heard in a long time, a name that belonged to a life that no longer existed. How did that man know who she was? Who had sent him? Could they be collectors of some old debt? Or perhaps someone from the government wanting to take Lily away from her? Fear took hold of Margaret. Her heart raced in her chest, and she instinctively pulled Lily closer, positioning herself between her daughter and that stranger. She didn't respond, just looked at the man with suspicion and fear, waiting for him to reveal his intentions. The man seemed to notice her fear and opened a small smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that seemed more like a mask than a genuine expression. "Oh, you don't need to be afraid. I didn't come to cause problems," said the man, opening his briefcase and taking out a thick paper envelope, golden in color, with embossed, decorated edges. "I came to deliver this to you," he continued, extending the envelope towards Margaret. She looked at the envelope as if it were a venomous snake, making no movement to take it, her mind running in circles trying to understand what was happening. "What is this?" asked Margaret, her voice coming out hoarse and suspicious, keeping her hands at her sides, refusing to touch the envelope. The man continued holding the extended envelope, patiently waiting for her to take it, his expression remaining neutral and professional. People passed around them on the sidewalk, some casting curious glances at that strange scene, but most simply going their way, indifferent to the drama unfolding there. Lily came out a bit from behind her mother, her eyes fixed on the golden envelope that shone under the morning sunlight, fascinated by the beautiful object so different from everything she normally saw. Margaret felt Lily move and pulled her back, keeping her daughter protected behind her, her eyes never leaving the face of the man in the suit. "It's an invitation," the man replied simply, as if that explained everything, as if it were the most normal thing in the world to deliver invitations to beggars on the street. He waved the envelope slightly, a subtle suggestion for Margaret to take it soon, his patience beginning to show signs of wear. "An invitation to what?" insisted Margaret, crossing her arms over her chest, her posture defensive, her entire body tense and ready to grab Lily and run if necessary. "To Mr. Charles Whitmore's gala," explained the man, pronouncing the name as if it belonged to someone very important, someone Margaret should know and admire. But Margaret did know that name, knew it very well, and hearing it made her blood freeze in her veins, made her stomach churn, made all the painful memories of the past years surface like a destructive tsunami. Charles Whitmore, the man who had destroyed her family, the man responsible for her husband's death, the man who had thrown them into misery and onto the street without a hint of remorse. What did that monster want with them now? Why would he send an invitation? Margaret felt anger boil inside her, mixing with fear and confusion, creating a whirlwind of emotions that made her dizzy. She shook her head vigorously, taking a step back, moving away from the man and his cursed envelope. "I don't want it," said Margaret, her voice coming out louder than she intended, loaded with all the pain and anger she had carried within herself for so long. "I'm not going anywhere, and especially not to anything related to that man," she continued, spitting out the words with venom. The man in the suit didn't seem surprised by her reaction, as if he already expected it, and kept the envelope extended, impassive. "Mr. Whitmore insists on your presence," the man persisted, his voice still calm but with a firmness that wasn't there before, making it clear that this was not exactly an invitation, but almost an order. Margaret laughed, a bitter sound without joy that escaped from her throat like a strangled cry. The idea of Charles Whitmore insisting on anything related to them was absurd, it was cruel, it was just another one of that man's malicious games. She knew he did nothing out of kindness, that there was always a selfish and destructive motive behind each of his actions. "Why would he invite us?" asked Margaret, her voice trembling now, not from fear, but from pure, intense anger. She wanted to scream. She wanted to take that envelope and tear it into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to make the man in the suit understand that they were not toys for Charles Whitmore to play with. But she controlled herself, took a deep breath, waiting for the answer she knew she wouldn't like to hear. The man in the suit finally lowered the envelope, holding it with both hands in front of his body, and for the first time his face showed an expression, a small smile that was both cold and satisfied. "He said you are essential for the evening's entertainment," the man replied, letting the words hang in the air like slow poison. Margaret felt as if she had been punched in the stomach, all the air leaving her lungs at once, her knees almost giving way under the weight of that revelation. Entertainment. They were entertainment. Charles Whitmore wanted to display them, humiliate them in front of his rich and powerful friends, use their suffering as amusement for his cruel and heartless guests. The reality of the situation fell on Margaret like an avalanche, crushing her, making her realize that even after everything they had been through, even living on the streets, even having lost everything, Charles Whitmore was still not satisfied, still wanted more, still wanted to destroy them completely. Tears of rage and humiliation burned in Margaret's eyes, but she held them back, refusing to cry in front of that man, refusing to show weakness. Lily squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the tension emanating from Margaret's body, not fully understanding what was happening, but knowing it was something bad, something very bad. "We're not going," said Margaret, her voice firm now, determined even though her entire body was trembling with emotion. "You can tell your boss that we are not his circus animals," she continued, turning to leave, pulling Lily with her. "The party is tomorrow night at 8 o'clock, the man said behind them, completely ignoring Margaret's refusal, his voice echoing in the busy street. Margaret didn't turn around, didn't look back, continued walking with Lily by her side, their steps quick and determined, moving them away from that terrible situation. But she could hear the man's footsteps behind them, following them. And then he spoke again, louder this time. "There will be food, Mrs. Margaret. Lots of food," he said, and Margaret felt her steps falter for a moment. "And doctors will be present. Private doctors who can examine your daughter for free," the man continued. And this time Margaret stopped completely, frozen in the middle of the sidewalk. Lily also stopped, looking at her mother with confusion, not understanding why they had stopped running away. Margaret closed her eyes, squeezing them tightly, feeling the tears finally escape and run down her dirty cheeks. Food and a doctor, the two things that Lily needed most at that moment, the two things that Margaret couldn't give her, being offered in exchange for her humiliation. It was an impossible choice. It was cruel. It was exactly the kind of perverse game that Charles Whitmore loved to play. "Please go away," whispered Margaret, her voice breaking, her hands trembling at her sides. She heard the man's footsteps approaching again, stopping right beside them. "The address is in the invitation, as well as all the information," the man said, and Margaret felt something being placed in her bag, the golden envelope being stuffed in there without her permission. Then she heard the man's footsteps moving away, walking back in the direction they had come from, until the sound completely disappeared into the crowd. Margaret stood there for long minutes, silent tears streaming down her face. Lily by her side, holding her hand and waiting patiently, as she always did. People passed around them, no one asking if everything was okay. No one offering help, just indifferent faces in an indifferent city. Finally, Margaret opened her eyes and looked down at Lily, seeing her daughter's pale, sick face, seeing the cough that was beginning again to shake that small, fragile body. She thought of food, of a plate full of hot and nutritious food that Lily could eat until she was satisfied, thought of a doctor examining her daughter and giving her medicines that would stop the cough, that would bring down the fever. And then she thought of Charles Whitmore laughing at her, mocking her, using them as entertainment for his rich friends. "Are we going home, Mom?" asked Lily with her weak and tired voice, calling home the cold and hard storefront where they slept every night. Margaret looked around at the big and cruel city that had swallowed them and felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. "Oh, yes, my daughter, let's go," replied Margaret, wiping away her tears with the back of her hand, trying to compose herself so as not to frighten Lily more than the girl already was. They walked slowly back toward the storefront, completely forgetting about the bakery, hunger now seeming insignificant compared to the whirlwind of emotions that Margaret felt. Each step seemed to weigh tons, each breath seemed to hurt, and Margaret fought against the desire to simply sit in the middle of the sidewalk and give up on everything. But she couldn't give up, not while Lily needed her, not while her daughter depended on her to survive in that cruel and merciless world. They arrived at the storefront when the sun was already high in the sky, the midday heat contrasting brutally with the cold of the previous night. Margaret helped Lily sit down, took the blanket from the bag, and spread it on the ground so the girl could lie down comfortably, or at least as comfortably as possible, on a concrete floor. Lily lay down immediately, exhausted from walking and constant coughing, closing her eyes and falling asleep almost instantly. Margaret sat down beside her daughter, observing that pale and sick little face, watching the difficult breathing rise and fall in the small chest. She placed her hand on Lily's forehead and felt the heat of the fever, higher than the night before, and cold fear squeezed her heart. "She needs a doctor," Margaret whispered to herself, the raw and undeniable reality of those words hurting more than anything. Margaret opened the bag with trembling hands, her fingers searching among the few belongings, until they found the golden envelope that the man in the suit had left there. She pulled it out slowly, as if it were something dangerous, and stared at that beautiful and expensive paper, so different from everything that was part of her life now. The envelope had her name written in elegant golden letters, and just holding it made Margaret feel dirty, contaminated by Charles Whitmore's wickedness. She turned the envelope in her hands, undecided, torn between tearing it to pieces or opening it and reading what was written inside. Her pride told her to throw it in the trash, to never give Charles Whitmore the satisfaction of seeing them humiliated at his party. But her mother's love, her desperation at seeing Lily getting worse each day, pushed her to consider the possibility, as painful as it might be. "What do I do?" Margaret asked out loud, looking at Lily sleeping beside her, hoping that somehow the answer would come. But no answer came, only the heavy silence of the street, the distant noise of traffic, and the difficult breathing of her sick daughter. Margaret held the envelope against her chest, closed her eyes, and allowed herself to cry. Silent tears of pain, anger, and desperation running down her face while the sun continued to shine indifferently over the city. The day of the party arrived like a death sentence, bringing with it a grey sky that seemed to reflect Margaret's state of mind as she and Lily prepared to face what was to come. Margaret had spent the previous night without sleeping, turning from one side to the other on the cold storefront, looking at the golden envelope that she had finally opened and read. The invitation was as pretentious as she had imagined, full of elegant words and details about the most important gala of the year, where the city's elite would gather to celebrate the success of the great businessman Charles Whitmore. Each word that Margaret read was like a stab in her heart, reminding her of everything they had lost, of everything that terrible man had stolen from them. But at the end of the invitation, there was a line written by hand in perfect cursive, which simply said that medical assistance would be available for all those present, and that line had been what finally convinced Margaret to make the most difficult decision of her life. Lily needed a doctor, and Margaret would do anything, even submit to public humiliation, to ensure that her daughter received the necessary treatment. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" asked Lily, as Margaret tried to arrange the girl's tangled hair with her fingers, since they didn't have a brush. Margaret swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded, forcing a smile on her lips that was far from what she felt in her anguished heart. "Yes, my daughter, we'll be fine," Margaret lied, her voice coming out stronger than she felt as she picked up the blanket they had used as a bed and carefully folded it. They had few clothes to choose from. In fact, they had no choice at all. They would have to go to the party in the same worn and stained clothes they wore every day. Margaret wore faded jeans with a hole in the knee, a blue knit blouse that once belonged to someone else and was stretched and shapeless, and a brown coat with torn lining. Lily wore her pink coat covered in polka dots, grey sweatpants that were too big for her, and old sneakers without laces. Margaret tried to clean their clothes as much as possible with a damp cloth she wet in a public fountain, rubbing the most visible stains, but she knew it was useless, that nothing could make them look presentable for that kind of event. She looked at Lily and saw the extreme paleness of the girl's face, the deep circles under her eyes, the cracked lips, and felt a mixture of love and pain so intense it almost made her give up everything. "You look beautiful, my princess," said Margaret, caressing Lily's face with infinite tenderness. Lily smiled weakly, a shadow of the radiant smile she used to have when they were still a happy family, when they still had a home. They began to walk toward the address written on the invitation, an upscale neighborhood of the city that was more than an hour's walk from where they were. Margaret held Lily's hand firmly, walking slowly so the girl wouldn't get too tired, stopping every few blocks when the cough returned to shake Lily's small body. The streets began to change as they approached the wealthy neighborhood. The sidewalks became cleaner, the buildings taller and more beautiful, the trees greener and well-maintained. Luxury cars passed by them at high speed, their shiny bodies reflecting the sun that had finally appeared between the clouds. Margaret felt the stares of people passing by, looks of contempt and disgust, people crossing the street to avoid passing close to them, mothers pulling their children away as if poverty were a contagious disease. Each look was a stab to Margaret's dignity, but she kept her head high, refusing to bow, refusing to appear ashamed of who she was or the situation she found herself in. Lily walked beside her mother in silence, her large eyes observing everything around her with a mixture of fascination and fear. "Mom, these houses are so big," commented Lily, her voice weak but full of childish admiration as she saw the mansions that began to appear. Margaret squeezed her daughter's hand, feeling her heart heavy as she realized that Lily barely remembered when they themselves lived in a nice house, when they had comfort and security. "Yes, they are, my daughter, they're very big," agreed Margaret, looking at the mansions with completely different feelings than Lily's, feeling only bitterness and anger. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of walking, they arrived at the address indicated on the invitation, and Margaret felt her stomach churn as she saw the enormous wrought-iron gates with gold details. Charles Whitmore's mansion was even more impressive and ostentatious than Margaret had imagined. A 3-story palace with Greek columns on the facade, perfectly maintained gardens with fountains and statues, and a circular driveway where expensive cars were parked. Dozens of elegantly dressed people entered through the main door, women wearing long designer dresses and jewelry that sparkled under the lights, men in impeccable tuxedos that probably cost more than Margaret had earned in years of work. Margaret and Lily stood outside the gates, observing that scene that seemed straight out of a movie, so distant from their reality that for a moment Margaret wondered if they had entered a parallel world. A tall, muscular security guard, dressed in a black suit with an earpiece, approached them with firm steps and a hard expression. "You can't stay here, move along," ordered the security guard, his deep and authoritative voice looking them up and down with barely disguised contempt. Margaret felt anger boiling inside her, but took a deep breath, took the golden envelope from her bag and extended it toward the man with a trembling hand. "We were invited," said Margaret, her voice coming out lower than intended, almost a whisper of shame and nervousness. The security guard took the envelope from Margaret and opened it, his eyes quickly scanning the contents, and then his expression changed from contempt to something between surprise and confusion. He took a radio from his belt and said something Margaret couldn't quite hear, waiting for a response that came through the device a few seconds later. The man put the radio away and returned the envelope to Margaret, his face now completely expressionless, professional. "Come in," said the security guard, opening a smaller gate beside the main one, a gate that was clearly used for staff and not for real guests. Margaret swallowed the humiliation, took Lily's hand and walked through the gate, feeling the guard's eyes burning into her back as they walked along the stone path leading to the mansion's entrance. Other security guards and staff watched them as they passed, some laughing discreetly, others whispering among themselves, and Margaret knew exactly what they were saying, knew they were a joke to these people. "Mum, why is everyone looking at us?" asked Lily, her voice small and frightened, squeezing Margaret's hand tighter. Margaret looked at her daughter and saw the fear in her dark eyes, saw how Lily was trying to make herself even smaller, trying to disappear under the cruel gazes. "Don't mind them, my child. Don't pay attention to anything you see or hear here," Margaret replied, stopping for a moment and crouching in front of Lily to be at eye level with her. She held her daughter's small face between her calloused hands and looked deeply into her eyes, trying to convey strength and courage she was far from feeling. "We came here for a reason. We came so you could see a doctor, and that's all we're going to think about, okay?" continued Margaret, her voice firm but full of emotion. Lily nodded, tears shining in her eyes but not falling, being brave as she always was, as she always needed to be. Margaret kissed her daughter's forehead, feeling the heat of the fever still present there, and stood up again, taking Lily's hand and continuing to walk toward the main entrance of the mansion. They climbed the white marble steps that led to the huge dark wooden door, and Margaret could hear the music coming from inside, classical music played by a live orchestra. and the sound of conversations and laughter from hundreds of people. An impeccably dressed butler, wearing a full uniform including white gloves, opened the door for them, and Margaret noticed how the man wrinkled his nose at the sight of them, as if an unpleasant smell had invaded his refined nostrils. "Invitation," said the butler, extending his gloved hand with an expression of total indifference. Margaret handed over the envelope again, watching as the man examined it with exaggerated care, as if looking for some forgery or error. Finally satisfied, the butler returned the invitation and gestured for them to enter. But Margaret noticed that he didn't greet them as he did the other guests, didn't offer the warm welcome she heard being given to the elegant people arriving. They entered the entrance hall, and Margaret felt as if she had entered another world, a world of obscene luxury and exaggerated wealth that made her stomach churn with anger and injustice. The hall was immense, with a ceiling at least 10 meters high, a gigantic crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling that must cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The floor was polished marble so shiny it reflected everything like a mirror, the walls covered with golden wallpaper and paintings that appeared to be original and extremely expensive artworks. A double marble staircase led to the second floor, covered with a red carpet secured by golden rods. Hundreds of people circulated through the space, all dressed in clothes that cost fortunes, all laughing and chatting animatedly, all belonging to that world of luxury and privilege. And then all eyes turned to Margaret and Lily, and the entire hall seemed to fall silent for a moment, as if someone had pressed a pause button in the middle of a film. "Look at those two," Margaret heard someone whisper loud enough for her to hear, a woman in a red dress with diamonds around her neck. "What are they doing here?" asked another voice, this time from a man in a grey tuxedo with a bow tie. Margaret felt her face burn with shame and anger, felt all those hundreds of eyes judging them, measuring them, despising them. She squeezed Lily's hand and began to walk toward the main hall where the music was coming from, keeping her head high even though every fiber of her being wanted to shrink and disappear. People literally moved away from their path, creating a wide corridor around them, as if Margaret and Lily were carriers of some terrible and contagious disease. Women covered their noses and mouths with their perfectly manicured hands. Men frowned with disapproval, and young people took out their cell phones to photograph and film that bizarre scene. Margaret could hear the clicks of cameras, could see the occasional flashes, and knew that her humiliation was being documented to be shared and ridiculed on social media. "Mom, I want to leave," whispered Lily, her voice breaking, tears finally escaping her eyes and streaming down her pale face. Margaret stopped and crouched again in front of her daughter, wiping away the tears with her thumb, her own heart broken into millions of pieces at the sight of Lily's suffering. "I know, my darling, I want to leave too, but we need to stay just a little longer, okay?" said Margaret, her voice trembling despite trying to sound firm and reassuring. Lily sobbed and nodded, wiping her face with the sleeve of her pink coat, trying to be strong for her mother. They continued walking until they reached the main ballroom, a space even larger and more luxurious than the entrance hall, with decor in shades of gold and white, round tables covered with fine linen tablecloths, and fresh flower arrangements that filled the air with a sweet perfume. A full orchestra played on an elevated stage at the back of the room. The musicians, dressed in black, concentrated on their sheet music. Waiters circulated among the guests carrying silver trays with champagne flutes and sophisticated canapes that looked like small works of art. And then, as if it had been rehearsed, two enormous security guards approached Margaret and Lily from both sides, so large and intimidating that Margaret instinctively pulled Lily closer to her. The men said nothing, just made gestures with their hands indicating that Margaret and Lily should follow them, and when Margaret hesitated, one of them placed his heavy hand on her shoulder, not violently but firmly enough to make it clear that it wasn't a request. "Where are you taking us?" asked Margaret, her voice coming out louder than intended, laden with fear and distrust. The guards didn't answer, just continued to push them gently but firmly toward the center of the ballroom, where an empty space had been left, as if waiting for them. Margaret understood then, with painful clarity, that all of this had been planned, that that empty space was theirs, that they were the spectacle of the night. The security guards positioned them in the center of the ballroom, right under one of the giant chandeliers, where the light was strongest and where all the guests could see them perfectly from all angles. Margaret looked around and saw hundreds of faces staring at them, some with curiosity, others with disgust, most with a mixture of cruel amusement and satisfied superiority. Lily hid behind Margaret, clutching her mother's brown coat tightly, trembling not from cold but from absolute fear. Margaret put her arm around Lily, pulling the girl forward and keeping her close, creating a protective barrier with her own body. The conversations in the ballroom gradually decreased until a heavy silence fell over everyone, and then the lights dimmed, leaving the ballroom in semi-darkness, except for the spotlights that lit up pointing directly at the stage. Margaret felt her heart race in her chest, beating so hard that it seemed everyone in the room could hear it, as she watched a figure climb onto the stage with slow, deliberate steps. Charles Whitmore appeared under the stage lights, and Margaret felt nausea rise in her throat at seeing that man for the first time in 2 years, that man who had destroyed her life, who had killed her husband, who had thrown her and Lily onto the streets without a shred of remorse. "Don't look at him, Lily, don't look," Margaret whispered to her daughter, turning the girl's face against her chest to protect her from the sight of that monster. But Margaret couldn't look away. She was trapped, staring at Charles Whitmore with a mixture of hatred, fear, and painful memories flooding her mind. Charles Whitmore was a 60-year-old man but looked younger, his well-cared-for face showing few wrinkles, thanks to expensive cosmetic treatments, his white hair perfectly cut and combed back with imported gel. He was tall, about 6 feet, with broad shoulders and an upright posture that exuded authority and arrogance. He wore a tailored black tuxedo that probably cost the equivalent of several months' salary for an ordinary person, Italian leather shoes so shiny they reflected the stage lights, and a solid gold watch on his wrist that weighed more than it appeared. But it was his face that really captured attention, the cold ice-blue eyes that looked at the world with superiority and disdain, and the smile that curved his thin lips, a smile that had nothing warm or genuine about it, but was calculated and cruel. He took the microphone that was on the pedestal in the center of the stage, bringing it slowly to his lips, savoring every second of the complete attention he had from everyone in the hall. "Good evening, my dear friends and distinguished guests," Charles began, his deep and well-modulated voice echoing perfectly through the hall's high-quality sound system. "It is with great pleasure that I welcome you once again to my humble home for our traditional annual gala," he continued, and Margaret almost laughed hysterically upon hearing that obscenely luxurious mansion being called humble. "Tonight is special for many reasons, and I would like to share with you something that I consider of extreme importance," said Charles, making a dramatic pause, his eyes sweeping across the hall before finally resting on Margaret and Lily in the center. Margaret felt those icy eyes on her and felt as if she had been struck by a ray of ice paralyzing her in place. "Today I have brought a living lesson about failure," announced Charles Whitmore, his voice filling every corner of the hall, each word falling on Margaret like heavy stones. The lights in the hall came on again, not completely but enough to illuminate Margaret and Lily in the center, turning them into the target of all gazes, an object of morbid curiosity. Margaret felt tears burning her eyes but refused to let them fall, refused to give Charles Whitmore the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She kept her chin up, shoulders back, and looked directly at that man on stage with all the anger and hatred she felt. Charles smiled, seeing her defiant expression, a smile even crueler than the previous one, as if he loved when his victims tried to fight back. In life, my friends, there are winners and losers, those who take advantage of opportunities and those who waste them, continued Charles, walking from one side of the stage to the other, gesturing with his free hand while holding the microphone with the other. There are those who work hard, who are smart, who make the necessary sacrifices to reach the top, he said, pounding his chest with his closed fist to emphasize the point. And there are those who simply don't have what it takes, who blame others for their failures, who live making themselves victims, he completed, and Margaret saw several guests nodding in agreement, as if those poisonous words made all the sense in the world. "Tonight I have brought perfect examples of the second group," said Charles, and then he extended his arm, pointing directly at Margaret and Lily with his index finger, as if he were pointing at animals in a zoo. "See what happens to those who didn't know how to take advantage of the opportunities life gives," exclaimed Charles Whitmore, his voice increasing in volume, full of cruel enthusiasm and perverse satisfaction. And then it happened. The sound that Margaret feared and expected at the same time, the sound that confirmed all her worst expectations about that terrible night. Laughter filled the hall, starting low and hesitant, but quickly growing in volume and intensity, until hundreds of people were laughing, pointing, making comments among themselves while looking at Margaret and Lily as if they were the funniest thing they had ever seen. Margaret felt each laugh like a slap in the face, each mocking look like a deep cut in her soul, each cruel comment wounding her soul like sharp words. She looked at Lily and saw that the girl was crying silently, her small body trembling with sobs she tried to contain, her face buried in Margaret's coat, trying to hide from that unbearable cruelty. "It's all right, my daughter, it's all right," Margaret whispered in Lily's ear, blatantly lying. Because nothing was all right. Nothing would be all right after that. Margaret hugged Lily tightly, turning her completely so that the girl had her back to the stage and to all those cruel faces, protecting her as much as she could from that horrible situation that she herself had put her daughter in by deciding to come to that cursed party. I'm sorry," Margaret repeated quietly, the tears finally escaping from her eyes and running silently down her face, wetting Lily's hair as she held her. She felt the anger growing inside her, anger at Charles Whitmore, anger at those people who were laughing, but mostly anger at herself for having been so foolish, so desperate, so stupid as to believe that something good could come from that situation. The laughter continued for long minutes that seemed like hours, echoing through the luxurious hall, mixing with the music of the orchestra that had resumed playing a cheerful and carefree melody. Margaret remained firmly in place, refusing to flee, refusing to give Charles Whitmore the additional satisfaction of seeing them running out in despair. She waited, embracing Lily, letting those people laugh as they pleased, letting them take their photos and make their videos, letting them entertain themselves with others suffering in the most despicable way possible. Gradually, the laughter began to subside, the guests returning their attention to their conversations and drinks, the show apparently having come to an end. Charles Whitmore descended from the stage and disappeared among the crowd of admirers who clustered around him, all wanting to congratulate him, all wanting to say how wonderful the party was, all wanting to flatter him and gain his favor. Margaret remained standing in the center of the hall with Lily, ignored now that the entertainment had ended, the two like forgotten pieces of furniture that no one paid attention to anymore. She felt the humiliation so deeply that it seemed to hurt in every part of her being. "Can we leave now?" asked Lily, her voice muffled against Margaret's chest, weak and broken from so much crying. Margaret opened her mouth to answer yes, to say that they would leave immediately and never come back, never subject themselves to that again. But then she remembered the only reason they had come, remembered what the man in the suit had promised. "Not yet, my daughter, not yet," answered Margaret, her voice hoarse with contained emotion, caressing Lily's back in comforting circular movements. She looked around the hall, searching for someone who could indicate where the doctors who were supposedly available were, looking for some medical room or makeshift office, looking for any sign that that promise had not been just another cruel lie. Her eyes scanned the elegant guests, the waiters circulating with trays, the musicians on stage, but she saw nothing that looked like a doctor or medical equipment. Panic began to grow in Margaret's chest, the terrible possibility that they had been deceived, that they had submitted to that horrible humiliation for nothing, that there would be no doctor at all for Lily. She gently released Lily and held the girl's face between her hands, wiping away the tears that still ran down her pale cheeks. "Stay here a moment, okay? I'm going to look for the doctor," said Margaret, trying to sound confident although her heart was beating uncontrollably with fear and anxiety. Lily nodded, wiping her nose with the sleeve of her coat, her eyes red and swollen from crying so much. Margaret quickly kissed her daughter's forehead and then began to walk through the hall looking for someone who could help her, ignoring the glances they still occasionally received from guests passing nearby. "Excuse me," said Margaret to a waiter passing by carrying a tray of empty glasses, her voice coming out hesitant and low. The waiter stopped and looked at her with an expression of surprise and discomfort, as if he hadn't expected to be approached by her. "Yes," replied the waiter, a young man of at most 25 years, thin and nervous, adjusting his bow tie while quickly looking around as if he feared being seen talking to Margaret. Margaret swallowed her pride once more and asked what she needed to know. even if every word cost a piece of her dignity. "I was told there would be doctors available at the party. Do you know where I can find them?" asked Margaret, her hands trembling slightly at her sides, desperately hoping for a positive response. The waiter frowned, confused, and shook his head negatively. "Doctors? I don't know anything about doctors, Ma'am," he replied, his voice low and quick, clearly wanting to end that conversation as quickly as possible. "But they said there would be the invitation, said there would be medical assistance," insisted Margaret, her voice beginning to rise in tone, desperation beginning to take over her. The waiter merely shrugged his shoulders, taking a step back, and then quickly walked away before Margaret could ask more questions. Margaret stood there for a moment, feeling the world spin around her, feeling nausea rise up her throat, feeling the terrible reality of the situation fall on her like a ton of bricks. "No, no, no," she whispered to herself, shaking her head in denial, refusing to accept that all of it had been a lie, a trap, an elaborate cruelty just to humiliate them even more. She searched for Lily with her eyes and saw her still standing in the same place where she had left her, small and fragile in the middle of that enormous and luxurious hall, so out of place that it hurt to look. Margaret stumbled back to where Lily was, her uncertain steps as if the polished marble floor were quicksand, trying to swallow her with each movement. The discovery that there were no doctors, that everything had been an elaborate lie to bring them there and humiliate them, weighed on her shoulders like an impossible burden to carry. She wanted to scream, wanted to run, wanted to take Lily and leave that cursed place immediately, but her feet seemed stuck to the floor, as if some invisible force kept her trapped in that nightmare hall. When she reached Lily, Margaret knelt in front of her daughter and held her small cold hands, looking into the girl's dark eyes that observed her with such confidence and hope that it made Margaret's heart shatter. How would she tell Lily that there was no doctor, that everything had been in vain, that the humiliation they had suffered would serve no purpose other than cruel entertainment for those horrible people? Tears burned in Margaret's eyes, but she blinked quickly, trying to keep them under control, not wanting Lily to see the complete despair she felt. "Mum, will the doctor see me now?" Lily asked with her weak and hopeful voice, squeezing Margaret's hands tightly. Margaret opened her mouth to respond, but no sound came out, her throat closed by the emotion that threatened to completely suffocate her. Before Margaret could find words to answer, the sound of microphone feedback echoed through the hall, that sharp and unpleasant sound that made everyone present cover their ears and look irritably toward the stage. Charles Whitmore was there again, standing under the spotlights, holding the microphone with one hand while the other was in his tuxedo pants pocket, his relaxed and confident posture of someone who was completely in control of the situation. His smile was even wider now, his light blue eyes shining with malicious amusement as he looked directly at Margaret and Lily in the center of the hall. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine seeing that expression, knowing instinctively that something worse was coming, that the initial humiliation had been just the beginning of the show Charles had planned for that night. She quickly stood up and pulled Lily behind her, creating a protective barrier with her own body, her maternal instincts screaming that she needed to protect her daughter from whatever was about to happen. The conversations in the hall gradually diminished until silence fell again, all eyes turning to the stage, all attention focused on the host who clearly had more to say. "Excuse the interruption, my dear friends," Charles began, his voice coming out smooth and polite through the speakers, but Margaret could detect the poison hidden beneath that cordial tone. "But I would like to take this unique opportunity to share with you a fascinating story. A real story about choices and consequences," he continued, making a dramatic pause as he walked from one side of the stage to the other, like a predator circling its prey. Margaret felt her stomach turn, nausea rising up her throat as she watched Charles prepare the ground for whatever he planned to do next. She looked around the hall, searching for some exit, some escape route, but she was surrounded by hundreds of people, all looking with curiosity and anticipation, all clearly waiting for more entertainment at her and Lily's expense. The security guards who had escorted them to the center of the hall were still strategically positioned around them, not close enough to seem threatening, but near enough to block any escape attempt. Margaret was trapped, completely and utterly trapped like an animal in a snare, and Charles Whitmore knew it, could see it in his satisfied and cruel smile. "You see these two women here in the center of the hall. Charles asked, pointing to Margaret and Lily again with a broad and theatrical gesture. "This is Margaret Collins and her daughter Lily," he announced, and Margaret felt a shock run through her body upon hearing their full names being pronounced aloud for all those strangers. "And I have a very interesting story to tell about them," Charles continued, his smile widening even more. "A story about waste, laziness, and absolute failure," he completed, each word falling on Margaret like lashes, each syllable designed to hurt and humiliate. "3 years ago, Margaret worked here for my company," began Charles, lying blatantly, distorting the truth in such a skillful way that Margaret was momentarily speechless. Her husband Robert had been Charles's partner. They had built the business together from scratch. But Charles was rewriting history in front of all those guests, transforming her husband into a mere employee. "She had a stable job, a decent salary, all the opportunities in the world to thrive," continued Charles, his voice filling the hall with elaborate lies. "But what did she do with those opportunities?" "She wasted them completely," he said, shaking his head with false disappointment. Margaret felt anger boiling inside her, felt the words of denial rising up her throat, wanting to scream the truth to all those who were listening, but her voice seemed to have disappeared, stolen by shock and the magnitude of the injustice she was witnessing. "It's not true," whispered Margaret to herself, shaking her head, her hands closing into fists at her sides. "None of this is true," she repeated, her voice coming out hoarse and broken, tears of anger and helplessness running down her face. But no one was listening to her. All ears were tuned to the poisonous words of Charles Whitmore. Margaret was known for being late, for doing the bare minimum, for always finding excuses not to fulfill her responsibilities, continued Charles, inventing lies so elaborate that Margaret could hardly believe what she was hearing. Each word was a stab, each false accusation was a slap in the face. Each lie was psychological torture calculated to destroy any shred of dignity she might still have. The guests listened attentively, many nodding as if it all made sense, as if it were obvious that Margaret was responsible for her own misery. Margaret looked at those faces and saw judgment, saw contempt, saw morbid satisfaction from people who felt superior when seeing someone they considered inferior being publicly humiliated. "And when I finally had to fire her for incompetence, do you know what she did?" asked Charles rhetorically, making another dramatic pause to increase the suspense. "She sued the company, claiming injustice, trying to get money she hadn't earned through hard work," he answered, and Margaret felt her legs almost give way under the weight of that absurd lie. There had never been any lawsuit. There had never been any dismissal, just theft and betrayal on Charles's part, who had stolen her husband's company and left them with nothing. "That didn't happen," Margaret finally shouted, her voice coming out loud and desperate, echoing through the hall and making some heads turn toward her. "You're lying! You know you're lying!" she continued, her voice breaking with emotion, her entire body trembling with anger and despair. Charles stopped pacing the stage and looked at Margaret with an expression of false surprise, as if shocked that she had the audacity to interrupt him. "Oh, so you want to speak now? Want to give your version of the story?" he asked, his voice laden with sarcasm. "Please go ahead. I'm sure my guests would love to hear more excuses and unfounded accusations," he continued, making an inviting gesture with his free hand while holding the microphone with the other. But before Margaret could respond, before she could even process what to say, Charles was already speaking again, giving her no real chance to defend herself. "Her lawsuit was rejected, of course, because there was no merit in the accusations," said Charles, resuming his walk across the stage. "And instead of accepting defeat with dignity and looking for another job instead of striving to rebuild her life, do you know what Margaret did?" he asked again, his voice rising in tone, full of theatrical indignation. "She simply gave up, threw everything away, destroyed her own family with her bad choices," he answered, and Margaret felt as if she'd been punched in the stomach. "No, it wasn't like that," Margaret shouted again, her tears falling freely now, her entire body shaking with emotion. "You killed my husband! You stole everything from us!" she continued, her voice echoing through the hall, raw and desperate. But her words were met with laughter, loud and cruel laughter that filled the hall like a wave of pure poison. The guests laughed at her pain, laughed at her despair, laughed as if it were the funniest thing they had ever witnessed. Margaret looked around and saw cell phones raised, dozens of them, all pointed at her, filming, photographing, capturing every moment of her humiliation to be shared on social media, to be seen by thousands or millions of people. Flashes illuminated the hall like fireworks. Each camera click sounded like a wound to her soul, forever marking that moment. She saw people typing on their phones, probably posting on social media at that very moment, probably writing cruel comments and making jokes at her and Lily's expense. A look at her, blaming others for her own incompetence, Margaret heard someone say loud enough for her to hear. A woman in a green dress with a pearl necklace. "These people never take responsibility for their own failures," commented another guest, a fat man in a red tuxedo who laughed while filming with his phone. "How sad, using her daughter to gain pity," said a third voice, a young woman in a gold dress who made a disgusted face while taking selfies with Margaret in the background. Margaret felt each comment like a blade cutting her skin, each cruel word penetrating deep into her already shattered heart. Margaret looked at Lily and saw that the girl was trembling violently, her small body shaking like a leaf in the wind, tears silently streaming down her pale face as she watched all that happening. Lily's eyes were wide with fear and confusion, not fully understanding why these people were being so cruel, why they were laughing at her mother, why no one was helping. Margaret felt her heart break into millions of pieces, seeing her daughter's suffering, felt a pain so deep and overwhelming that for a moment she thought she might faint right there in the middle of that luxurious hall. She quickly knelt in front of Lily and pulled the girl into her arms, hugging her tightly, trying to protect her from that nightmare, trying to create a shield with her own body against all that cruelty. "Don't look at them, my daughter. Don't listen to anything they're saying," Margaret whispered in Lily's ear, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's okay, everything will be okay," she lied once again, knowing that nothing was okay, that nothing would be okay after this. Lily sobbed against Margaret's chest, her thin little arms clutching her mother's brown coat, as if it were the only real thing in a world that had become a surreal nightmare. "I want to go home, Mum, please, let's go home," Lily begged between sobs, her voice muffled against the fabric of the coat. Margaret closed her eyes tightly, squeezing Lily even more, wishing with all the strength of her being to be able to do that, to simply disappear from there and protect her daughter from all that pain. But Charles Whitmore wasn't finished, his voice echoing again through the speakers, cutting through the noise of laughter and conversation from the guests. "And look where your choices have led you," he said, pointing to Margaret and Lily embracing in the center of the hall as if they were animals on display. "Living on the streets, begging for food, destroying your own daughter's future through sheer laziness and lack of ambition," Charles continued, his voice full of false sadness and disappointment. "This, my friends, is a lesson about what happens when you don't take advantage of the opportunities life offers," he said, gesturing broadly like a teacher giving a lesson. "This is a lesson about personal responsibility, about hard work, about making the right choices in life," he concluded, and Margaret heard murmurs of agreement throughout the hall, heard people commenting about how sad but true it was, about how some people simply didn't have what it takes to succeed. The injustice of it all was so overwhelming that Margaret could barely breathe. Each breath was a painful effort. Each beat of her heart was an agony. "He's lying," Margaret whispered to Lily, holding the girl's face between her hands and forcing her to look into her eyes. "Everything he's saying is a lie, do you understand?" "Everything is a lie," she repeated, needing Lily to believe her, needing at least her daughter to know the truth. Lily nodded weakly, tears still streaming down her face, trusting her mother as she always did. Charles descended from the stage slowly, his steps measured and deliberate, walking directly toward Margaret and Lily as the guests stepped aside to make way for him. He moved like a king traversing his domain, his posture erect and confident, his cruel smile never leaving his thin lips. Margaret observed his every step with a mixture of fear and hatred, her body tensing, preparing for whatever he planned to do next. When Charles came close to them, stopping just a few feet away, Margaret quickly stood up and placed herself in front of Lily, blocking the man's view of the girl. They stood there face to face for the first time in 2 years, looking into each other's eyes, Margaret with her face dirty with tears and marked by suffering, Charles with his expression of superiority and cruel satisfaction. The silence in the hall was absolute now, all guests observing that confrontation with morbid fascination, waiting to see what would happen next. "You destroyed my life," said Margaret, her voice coming out low but firm, carrying all the pain and anger she felt. "You stole everything from us, killed my husband, threw us onto the street, and now you've brought us here to humiliate us," she continued, each word coming out with difficulty but with absolute determination. Charles just smiled even more, clearly amused by the accusation, as if Margaret's words were a child's joke. "Ah, dear Margaret, always so dramatic, always blaming others," Charles responded, his voice loud enough for everyone in the hall to hear, still holding the microphone in his hand. "Your husband was an incompetent who didn't know how to manage money, who made disastrous business decisions and destroyed his own business," he said, lying with such conviction that Margaret almost doubted her own memories for a second. "I tried to help, offered to buy his part of the company before everything completely collapsed, but he was too stubborn to accept," Charles continued, completely rewriting the true story of how he had forged documents and stolen Robert's company. "And when he finally realized the size of the disaster he had created, when he couldn't deal with the consequences of his own actions, he simply gave up on life," Charles completed, referring to Robert's death in such a cold and cruel way that Margaret felt such intense anger that she could barely control herself in front of him. "Lies, lies," shouted Margaret, her voice coming out hoarse and desperate, her entire body shaking with impotent rage. "You forged documents, you stole his company, you did all this," she continued, but her words were swallowed by the renewed laughter of the guests who thought she was just being hysterical. "My husband died of heartbreak because of what you did. He died because you destroyed everything he built," Margaret screamed, tears running down her face, her voice breaking with emotion. Charles shrugged as if Margaret's accusations were completely unimportant, as if the death of a man was just an inconvenient detail in his success story. If he couldn't handle the business world, if he was too weak to face competition, then he really shouldn't have been in that world, said Charles, his words so cruel and inhuman that Margaret felt nausea rising in her throat. "And you, Margaret, you are equally weak, equally incompetent," he continued, looking her up and down with absolute contempt. "Instead of rebuilding your life, looking for a job, taking decent care of your daughter, you chose the easy path of begging," he said, and Margaret saw several guests nodding in agreement, completely convinced by his lies. "Do you see?" said Charles, turning to the audience of guests, opening his arms in a theatrical gesture. "This is the result of a life of wrong choices, of lack of discipline, of refusal to accept responsibility," he announced, his voice echoing through the hall. "And the most tragic of all is that this poor innocent child is being dragged down along with her mother," he continued, pointing to Lily, who was still behind Margaret. "A child who should be in school having a normal childhood, but instead is on the streets because her mother is too lazy to work," said Charles, and Margaret felt as if each word was a blade cutting her soul. "How dare you?" whispered Margaret, her voice coming out so low that only Charles could hear. "How dare you speak of my daughter?" she repeated, her voice rising in volume, full of fierce, protective anger. But Charles just laughed, a loud and artificial sound that echoed through the microphone, and the guests laughed along, that cruel, collective laughter that sounded like the sound of hell to Margaret. "And now see the supreme irony," said Charles, turning again to the guests. "I brought them here tonight not just as an example, but as a demonstration of charity," he announced, and Margaret felt confusion mixing with her anger. "I offered them the chance to come to this party, eat quality food, be in a clean and safe environment for one night," said Charles, painting himself as benevolent. "I even offered medical assistance for the sick child," he continued, and Margaret felt her stomach sink as she realized that promise had been just another lie, another manipulation tool to make them come and submit to this humiliation. "But even so, even receiving this undeserved generosity, all she does is accuse me and shout lies," said Charles, shaking his head with false sadness. "This, my friends, is ingratitude at its purest level," he declared, and Margaret heard murmurs of agreement, heard people commenting on how she should be grateful, on how she should accept help without complaining. The distorted reality that Charles had created was so complete, so convincing to those people who were already predisposed to believe the worst about the poor and disadvantaged, that Margaret realized there was nothing she could say that would make a difference. She was fighting a losing battle against an enemy much more powerful, much more influential, much crueler than she could ever be. Margaret felt the weight of defeat fall upon her like an avalanche, crushing all anger and indignation, leaving only a deep and overwhelming exhaustion. She looked at Lily and saw the girl trembling, pale, sweating from fever, coughing from time to time, and Margaret knew she needed to get her daughter out of there, that every second in that place was causing more damage to Lily's physical and emotional health. "We're leaving," said Margaret, her voice coming out firm despite everything, taking Lily's hand and turning to walk toward the exit. But Charles spoke again, his voice stopping Margaret in place as if it were an invisible chain binding her. "Running away again, Margaret? That's what you do best, isn't it? Running from problems instead of facing them?" Charles taunted, his voice full of sarcasm and contempt. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to maintain control, trying not to turn and physically attack that man, as every fiber of her being wished to do. "Or perhaps you finally want to say something in your defense? Finally want to stop being a victim and accept responsibility for your own life?" continued Charles, walking around them like a vulture circling a carcass. Margaret turned slowly, facing Charles once more, her eyes burning with unshed tears and contained anger. "I have nothing to say to you or to any of these people," said Margaret, her voice coming out low but clear, carrying dignity that she managed to gather from the depths of her wounded soul. "You've already decided who I am. You've already judged me without knowing the truth, and nothing I say will change that," she continued, looking around the room at all those judging faces. "So you admit your defeat?" "Admit that everything I said is true," pressed Charles, taking another step toward Margaret, invading her personal space, trying to intimidate her physically and psychologically. Margaret stood firm, not backing down, not showing fear, even though inside she was completely shattered. "I admit nothing," responded Margaret, her voice growing stronger now, fueled by a righteous anger that burned in her chest. "Except that you are a cruel and heartless man who finds pleasure in destroying others," she said, looking directly into Charles's cold blue eyes. "And that one day somehow the truth will come out, and everyone will see you as you really are," she completed, her words carrying absolute certainty. Charles laughed again, but this time Margaret detected a note of irritation in his laughter, as if finally she had managed to pierce his armor of arrogance. "Empty threats from a desperate woman," said Charles, waving his hand as if shooing away an irritating fly. "But since you refuse to defend yourself properly, since you prefer to play the victim instead of accepting reality, then I guess there is nothing more to say," he declared, turning to return to the stage. But before he could take more than 2 steps, a small but clear voice cut through the air, stopping everyone in the hall. "I want to speak," said Lily, and Margaret felt her heart stop for a second before racing a mile a minute. She turned quickly to look at her daughter and saw that Lily had taken a step forward, coming out from behind the protection of Margaret's body, her hands trembling, but extended, as if reaching for something very distant. Lily's eyes were red and swollen from crying, her face pale and sweaty with fever, her small body visibly trembling, but there was something different in her expression now, something that Margaret hadn't seen in a long time, a fierce determination that seemed to come from somewhere deep within the girl. "Lily, no," Margaret began, trying to pull her daughter back, trying to protect her from exposing herself further to that cruelty, but Lily gently freed herself from her mother's hand. "I need to speak, Mother," said Lily, looking at Margaret with eyes that seemed much older than her 12 years, eyes that had seen too much, suffered too much. "I need to tell the truth," she continued, her voice coming out weak but determined, each word costing a visible effort, but being said anyway. Margaret felt tears fill her eyes again, a mixture of fear for what might happen to Lily and pride for the incredible courage her daughter was showing. "My daughter, you don't have to do this," whispered Margaret, kneeling again in front of Lily, holding her thin shoulders. "Let me protect you. It's my job to protect you," she pleaded, her voice breaking. But Lily shook her head, a small sad smile appearing on her cracked lips. "You have always protected me, Mother. Always," said Lily, placing her small hand on Margaret's face, wiping away a tear that was running down. "But now it's my turn to protect you," she continued, and Margaret felt as if her heart would explode with love and pain simultaneously. Lily turned to face Charles Whitmore, that huge and powerful man who had destroyed her family, and raised her head as high as she could, trying to appear bigger than she was. "I want to speak," repeated Lily, her voice coming out louder this time, echoing through the hall that had gone completely silent. All the guests were watching that scene with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort, some looking genuinely surprised by the girl's boldness, others laughing quietly, thinking it would be more entertainment. Charles looked at Lily with an expression that mixed surprise and amusement, as if he couldn't believe that a child was challenging him. "Oh, the little one wants to speak too," said Charles, his voice loaded with cruel condescension. "How adorable, a child wanting to defend her incompetent mother," he continued, making some guests laugh. "Very well then, little Lily," said Charles, walking toward her with slow steps, stopping right in front of her, and bending down to get closer to her height, an attitude that seemed friendly, but was clearly intimidating. "Why don't you tell us your version of this sad story?" he asked, his smile wide and fake, his cold eyes studying every reaction from Lily. Lily didn't back away, didn't shrink, didn't show the fear that Margaret knew she must be feeling. "My mother isn't lying," Lily began, her voice trembling slightly but remaining firm. "You are the one who's lying. You know you're lying about everything," she said, looking directly into Charles's eyes with a courage that made Margaret fill with pride despite the terror she felt. Charles raised his eyebrows, his expression of amusement increasing. "Oh, really? And how would a little child like you know anything about business and adult matters?" he asked, his voice full of sarcasm, turning briefly to the guests as if inviting them to laugh along with the joke. "I know because I was there," replied Lily, her voice growing stronger now, fueled by memories and truth. "I remember when you used to come to our house, when you and my father were friends, when you worked together," she said. And Margaret saw a flash of something that could be concern quickly pass through Charles's eyes before being replaced again by amusement. "I remember you smiling and being kind, and my father trusting you as if you were family," continued Lily, tears beginning to stream down her face again, but her voice not breaking. "And I remember the day my father discovered what you did. The day he came home with papers in his hands crying, saying that you had stolen everything from him," said Lily, each word coming out with more strength, with more emotion. Margaret placed her hand over her mouth, sobbing silently, remembering that terrible day too. Lily continued looking at Charles Whitmore without averting her eyes, her small body trembling, not only from fever, but from intense emotion, tears running down her pale face as painful memories flooded her mind. Margaret remained beside her daughter, a protective hand on Lily's shoulder, feeling every word the girl said as if they were her own, reliving those terrible days when everything fell apart, when the life they knew was torn from them so brutally and unjustly. The hall remained in absolute silence, hundreds of eyes fixed on that small, sick girl who dared confront the most powerful man in the room, and Margaret could feel that something had changed in the air, that people were no longer laughing, that something in Lily's story had touched an uncomfortable place in those privileged hearts. Charles continued standing in front of them, his expression oscillating between forced amusement and growing irritation, his clear blue eyes studying Lily as if trying to decide whether she represented a real threat or just a dramatic child repeating fantasies. "My daughter, you've said enough," Margaret said softly, squeezing Lily's shoulder, fearing what Charles might do if the girl continued, fearing the retaliation that would certainly come. "Let's leave now before things get even worse," she whispered, trying to gently pull Lily toward the exit. But Lily freed herself from Margaret's hand with surprising determination, shaking her head in denial. "No, Mother, not yet," said Lily, her voice coming out stronger than Margaret expected, fueled by a courage that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Lily looked around the luxurious hall, her eyes scanning those elegant and well-fed faces, those people who had laughed at her and her mother minutes ago, and something inside her decided that she would not leave without telling the whole truth. "I need to tell the complete story. I need everyone to know what really happened," Lily continued, wiping the tears from her face with the sleeve of her worn-out pink coat. Margaret felt fear tighten her chest, fear of what Charles might do, fear that Lily would hurt herself even more in this process, but at the same time felt immense pride in her daughter's courage. Charles let out a short artificial laugh, shaking his head as if he were dealing with a stubborn child who insisted on telling fanciful stories. "Very well, little one. If you insist on speaking, then speak," said Charles, his voice laden with cruel condescension, making a broad gesture with his hand. "Tell your fantasy story to all of us," he continued, turning to the guests with a complicit smile, as if telling them to prepare for more entertainment. "But after that, you and your mother will leave and never come back here. Is that clear?" he completed, his voice taking on a threatening tone. Lily nodded, accepting those terms without hesitation. Charles was still holding the microphone in his hand, casually swinging it beside his body, and Lily looked at that object with determination growing in her eyes. She extended her trembling hand toward the microphone, her small fingers reaching for that symbol of power and voice that Charles had used to humiliate them. Charles looked at Lily's extended hand and then at her face, genuine surprise appearing in his expression for the first time that night. "You want the microphone?" he asked, laughing again, but this time the laugh sounded less confident, less controlled. "Well, why not? Let's give the child the microphone. Let's let her have her moment on stage," said Charles, extending the microphone toward Lily with an exaggerated and theatrical gesture. "Show us all how brilliant and articulate you are," he added, sarcasm dripping from every word. Lily took the microphone with both hands, holding it firmly despite her trembling fingers, feeling the weight of that object that seemed disproportionate to her size. Margaret watched her daughter take the microphone and felt her heart race, a mixture of fear and hope battling inside her chest. "Lily, are you sure?" asked Margaret, her voice low and concerned, placing her hand on her daughter's arm. "You don't need to do this, we can simply leave," she insisted, offering one last escape. But Lily looked at her mother, and Margaret saw absolute determination in those dark eyes. "I am sure, Mother," replied Lily, her voice firm despite her trembling body and the fever burning her skin. Lily brought the microphone to her lips, and the hall fell into expectant silence, all eyes fixed on that small sick girl dressed in worn-out clothes who dared to use the voice that Charles had given her, thinking it would only be for more humiliation. But when Lily began to speak, her voice came out clear and firm, amplified by the high-quality speakers, echoing through every corner of that luxurious hall with a strength that surprised even Margaret. "My father, Robert Collins, worked 30 years for this man," Lily began, pointing at Charles with her free hand, and Margaret saw Charles flinch slightly upon hearing Robert's full name being spoken aloud. Charles's first lie had been exposed, the claim that Robert was just an employee crumbling with those simple words. "No, wait, that's not right," Charles began, trying to interrupt, taking a step toward Lily. But the girl stepped back, continuing to speak. "My father and Mr. Whitmore were partners, they were friends. They built the business together from nothing when both had nothing," said Lily, her voice gaining strength with every word, memories of stories her father used to tell flowing through her. Margaret remembered those stories too, from the nights when Robert would come home tired but happy, telling about the business's progress, about how he and Charles were achieving their dreams together. "They started with a small store, just the two of them, working days and nights non-stop," Lily continued, and Margaret could see that some guests were really listening now, really paying attention, the previous mockery giving way to something that seemed like genuine curiosity. "My father handled the technical part, the production, the quality, while Mr. Whitmore took care of sales and customers," said Lily, detailing the partnership in a way that clearly wasn't a child's invention, but real memories of conversations overheard. Charles tried to interrupt again, his voice coming out loud and irritated. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to stand here listening to lies from a child who," he began. But this time several guests made sounds of protest, wanting to hear the rest of the story. "Let the girl speak," said a female voice from the back of the room, and Margaret searched with her eyes but couldn't identify who had spoken. "Yes, let her finish," agreed another voice, this one male, and suddenly it seemed that the tide had turned, that the audience who had previously been on Charles's side now wanted to hear Lily's version. Charles looked around with an expression of frustration and anger, realizing he had lost control of the situation, that he had given the girl a powerful weapon by handing her the microphone. "You don't understand, she's just—" He tried again but was silenced by more voices asking him to let Lily speak. Margaret could hardly believe what she was seeing, a subtle but real change in the energy of the room. Lily waited until silence fell again, her eyes scanning those faces that now watched her with genuine attention instead of cruel mockery. "For 10 years they worked together, and the business grew," said Lily, her voice trembling slightly but remaining firm. "From 1 small store to 2, then 5, then 10, she recounted, painting the picture of the success they had built together. "My father always said that Mr. Whitmore was like a brother to him, that he trusted him with his life," continued Lily, and Margaret saw tears fill her daughter's eyes as she recalled those words from her father. "And then 3 years ago, when the business was bigger than ever, when they had more than 20 stores and hundreds of employees, something changed," said Lily, making a dramatic pause, and Margaret could feel the tension in the air, everyone waiting to hear what came next. "My father began to notice strange things, documents that needed his signature, but that he didn't remember signing, decisions being made without his consultation," Lily recounted. And Margaret remembered those terrible months when Robert would come home increasingly worried, increasingly confused. "He tried to talk to Mr. Whitmore, tried to understand what was happening, but he always received excuses, was always reassured that everything was fine," said Lily, her voice becoming heavier with emotion. "Until the day he discovered the truth," she completed, and the silence in the room was so absolute that Margaret could hear her own heart beating. "What truth? What truth has your daughter made up this time?" interrupted Charles, his voice now sounding defensive, less confident, and Margaret realized he was beginning to get really worried. Lily looked directly at Charles, her dark eyes burning with the intensity of someone much older than her 12 years. "The truth that you had forged his signature on documents, that you had transferred the company's ownership to your name alone, that you had stolen everything my father had built," said Lily, each word falling like a bomb in the silence of the room. Sounds of shock echoed among the guests, people turning to each other whispering, cell phones being raised again, but this time not to laugh, but to document a serious accusation. "This is defamation. This is an absolute lie," shouted Charles, his face turning red with anger, taking large steps toward Lily as if he were going to forcibly snatch the microphone from her. But Margaret moved quickly, placing herself between Charles and Lily, confronting that man with all the protective maternal strength she possessed. "Don't come near my daughter," said Margaret, her voice coming out low but laden with threat. "You've done enough harm. You won't lay a hand on her," she continued, her fists clenched at her sides, ready to physically fight if necessary. Charles stopped, realizing that attacking a woman and a child in front of all those guests would not be a good image, even though he was furious. "Go on, Lily, tell them everything," encouraged Margaret, turning briefly to look at her daughter over her shoulder. Lily nodded, wiping away the tears that continued to fall, and brought the microphone to her lips again. "My father hired a lawyer, got the falsified documents, and was going to sue Mr. Whitmore," said Lily, her voice breaking a little but continuing. "He had evidence, he had witnesses. He had everything he needed to prove that he had been robbed," she recounted. And Margaret remembered those days when Robert was so hopeful, so certain that justice would be done. "But Mr. Whitmore is rich and powerful, has expensive lawyers and important friends," Lily continued, looking around the hall at those very important people. "He made the lawsuit disappear, made the witnesses change their testimonies, made it seem like my father was crazy and making things up," she said, exposing the systematic corruption that had destroyed any chance of Robert getting justice. Murmurs grew louder among the guests, some seeming genuinely shocked, others uncomfortable, and Margaret noticed that some people were looking at Charles with questioning expressions. "You're not going to believe the words of a desperate child against me, are you?" asked Charles, turning to his guests, trying to regain his authority. "I have known me for years. You know what kind of man I am," he insisted, but his voice sounded less convincing now, as if even he realized he was losing ground. Margaret felt something burning inside her, a spark of hope she hadn't felt in years, a possibility that maybe, just maybe, the truth could finally be heard. She looked at Lily and saw the girl shaking violently, the fever and the effort of speaking clearly taking its toll, and knew she needed to act quickly before Lily completely collapsed. "I have proof," Margaret said suddenly, her own voice surprising her with its strength and clarity. She gently released Lily and picked up the worn bag she had dropped on the floor at some point during all that confusion. With trembling hands, Margaret opened the bag and began to search at the bottom, among the few belongings they carried, until her fingers found what they were looking for. "I kept everything," said Margaret, pulling out a large yellowed envelope from the bag, an envelope she had protected with her life during their 2 years living on the streets. "When we lost everything, when they threw us onto the street, I managed to save some documents, some evidence of what Robert and Charles had together," she explained, her hands shaking so much she almost dropped the envelope. Charles took a step toward Margaret, his eyes fixed on the envelope as if it were a venomous snake. "That doesn't prove anything. They're just old papers that mean nothing," he said, but his voice betrayed nervousness, and Margaret saw sweat beginning to form on his forehead. "Why don't you let everyone see and judge for themselves?" challenged Margaret, holding the envelope against her chest. Margaret carefully opened the envelope, taking out carefully folded papers that she had protected from rain, cold, and all the dangers of life on the streets. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the first document, an original partnership contract between Robert Collins and Charles Whitmore, dated 28 years ago, when both were young and full of dreams. "This is the original partnership contract," said Margaret, her voice echoing through the hall without a microphone, but still being heard in the absolute silence that had fallen. 50% for Robert Collins, 50% for Charles Whitmore, she read, showing the document to the closest guests who leaned in to see better. "Both signatures are here notarized," Margaret continued, pointing to the signatures at the bottom of the document. Some guests took photos of the document, others just watched with shocked expressions, and Margaret saw that finally, she was being taken seriously. "This doesn't prove anything. Contracts can be modified over the years," said Charles, trying to discredit the document, but his voice sounded desperate now. "Legal modifications, yes, but not forgeries," Margaret replied, pulling another document from the envelope. "This one is a copy of the document you forged, transferring all the property to yourself alone," she said, showing the second paper. "Compare the signatures. Any expert can see they are different," continued Margaret, placing both documents side by side. A tall man with glasses and graying hair approached, looking at the documents with professional attention. "May I see?" he asked, and Margaret nodded, handing him the papers with trembling hands. The man examined both documents carefully, his eyes scanning each line, each signature, and then looked at Charles with a serious expression. "I've been a lawyer for 30 years, said the man, his authoritative voice echoing through the hall. "And these signatures are clearly different," he continued, tracing the differences with his finger. "The pen pressure, the angle of the letters, the way the surname is written, everything indicates they are from different people," he explained, and Margaret felt tears of relief fill her eyes. Finally, someone was validating what she and Robert always knew. Finally, the truth was being recognized. "He's wrong. He can't know this just by looking," Charles protested, but his voice was weak now, without conviction. "I can and I do know. I've testified in dozens of document forgery cases," the lawyer replied coldly. "And these documents should be examined by the authorities," he added, looking at Charles with clear disapproval. The hall exploded in conversation, everyone talking at once, some defending Charles, others questioning him, and Margaret felt as if the whole world was spinning around her. "Mom, I'm dizzy," Lily whispered, and Margaret turned immediately to see her daughter pale as wax, her eyes half closed, the microphone slipping from her hands. Margaret immediately dropped the documents and caught Lily in her arms before the girl fell, feeling the extreme heat of fever burning through her clothes. "Lily, my child, stay with me," Margaret pleaded, laying Lily on the cold marble floor, kneeling beside her, caressing the girl's sweaty face. Lily opened her eyes with effort, looking at her mother with a confused and disoriented expression. "Did I say everything, Mum? Did I tell the truth?" asked Lily, her voice coming out weak and slurred. "Yes, my daughter, yes, you were so brave, so strong," Margaret replied, tears falling freely as she held Lily's hand. "I'm so proud of you, so proud," she continued, kissing her daughter's hot forehead. Around them, guests began to approach, forming a circle, and Margaret looked up to see faces that had previously shown contempt, now showing concern. "The girl needs a doctor," said a woman in a blue dress, her voice laden with genuine concern. "She's burning with fever," agreed another person. "Someone call a doctor now," ordered someone, and Margaret saw people reach for their phones, making calls, finally offering real help. "Please, she needs help. She's so sick," Margaret pleaded, looking around at those faces, no longer caring about pride or dignity, just wanting her daughter to receive the necessary treatment. "Someone is already coming," assured a male voice, and Margaret nodded, turning her attention completely to Lily. Charles remained a few meters away, observing the entire scene with an expression that mixed anger, fear, and something that could be regret. But Margaret no longer cared about him at that moment. All her attention focused on Lily, who trembled in her arms. "Stay with me, my daughter, just a little longer," whispered Margaret, stroking Lily's sweaty hair. Lily opened her eyes again, focusing with difficulty on her mother's face. "I didn't want him to hurt you anymore, Mum," said Lily, her voice coming out in a whisper. "I needed to tell the truth for Dad," she continued, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes. "You did, my daughter. You made your father proud. You did the right thing," Margaret assured, her own voice breaking with emotion. A middle-aged man wearing an elegant grey suit approached, kneeling beside Margaret. "I'm a doctor," he said, and Margaret recognized the voice as one of those who had defended Lily earlier. "May I examine her?" he asked, and Margaret nodded immediately, moving back a bit to give space but keeping Lily's hand secure in hers. The doctor placed his hand on Lily's forehead, then on her neck, checking the lymph nodes, his movements quick and professional. "She has a very high fever," said the doctor, taking a small stethoscope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, placing the stethoscope on Lily's chest and listening carefully. "Several days. The cough started almost a week ago," Margaret replied, watching every movement of the doctor with desperate attention. The doctor frowned, his expression becoming serious as he listened to Lily's breathing. "She has a severe respiratory infection, probably developing into pneumonia," he said, looking at Margaret with eyes that showed genuine concern. "She needs to go to the hospital immediately. Needs intravenous antibiotics and monitoring," the doctor continued, already taking his phone from his pocket. "I'll call an ambulance now," he said, dialing quickly. Margaret felt the world spin, everything she had feared being confirmed by a professional. "Will she be all right? Please tell me she'll be all right," Margaret pleaded, her voice breaking completely. The doctor finished the call and looked at Margaret with a compassionate expression. "With proper treatment, yes, but we can't wait. It must be now," he responded honestly. "The ambulance is on its way. Should arrive in 5 minutes," he informed, placing his hand on Margaret's shoulder in a gesture of comfort. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, turning all her attention back to Lily, who had closed her eyes again. "My daughter, you're going to the hospital now. The doctors will take care of you. Everything will be fine," said Margaret, trying to sound confident despite the fear consuming her. Lily barely reacted, just a small movement of her head indicating that she had heard. The doctor remained kneeling beside them, constantly monitoring Lily, checking her pulse, observing her breathing, and Margaret felt immense gratitude for this stranger who was showing more humanity than she had experienced in years. Around them, the atmosphere in the hall had completely changed. Conversations now were worried whispers, people commenting about the documents Margaret had shown, about the story Lily had told, about the condition of the sick girl. Margaret heard fragments of conversations. "If what she said is true, this is terrible," a woman commented. "Those signatures really did look different," a man agreed. "The poor child is so sick," said another voice. "How could we have laughed at them before?" someone asked, the voice laden with guilt. Margaret felt a subtle but significant change in the energy of the hall, as if they were finally seeing her and Lily as human beings and not as entertainment or objects of contempt. Charles remained at a distance, watching everything with a closed expression, and Margaret saw that he was conversing intensely with some important-looking men, probably trying to control the damage, trying to find a way to discredit what had just happened. But Margaret no longer cared about Charles at that moment, didn't care about anything except Lily. "The ambulance is arriving," announced the doctor, hearing the sound of approaching sirens. "I'll go with you to the hospital. I'll make sure she receives the best treatment," he said, and Margaret looked at that man with tears of gratitude. Thank you so much," she whispered, her voice choked. "Why are you doing this? Why are you helping us?" she asked, needing to understand. The doctor looked at her with a gentle and sad expression. "Because I have a daughter her age," replied the doctor, looking at Lily with paternal affection. "And after hearing your story, after understanding what you've been through, I can't simply walk away and pretend I didn't see anything," he continued with sincerity. "And because what happened here tonight was wrong, deeply wrong," he added, looking briefly in Charles's direction with disapproval. Margaret felt more tears run down her face, but this time they weren't just tears of pain, but also of relief and gratitude for finally finding someone who showed genuine compassion. Paramedics rushed into the hall pushing a stretcher, and the doctor immediately began updating them about Lily's condition. "High fever, severe respiratory infection, suspected pneumonia, needs intravenous antibiotics and urgent monitoring," he said quickly, using medical terms that Margaret barely understood, but that sounded terribly serious. The paramedics acted with professional efficiency, carefully placing Lily on the stretcher, connecting an oximeter to her finger, covering her with a thermal blanket. "Mother, are you coming with us?" asked one of the paramedics, a young woman with her hair tied in a ponytail. Yes, I'm going with her," Margaret responded immediately, getting up quickly, her legs shaky from all the tension and emotion. "Don't leave her alone for even a second," Margaret pleaded, looking at the paramedics with desperate eyes. "Stay calm. We'll take good care of her," assured the female paramedic with a gentle smile. While the paramedics prepared to take Lily outside, Margaret quickly bent down to grab the bag with her belongings and the documents she had dropped on the floor. But when she got close to the papers, she saw Charles also moving toward them, clearly intending to grab them first, probably to destroy them. "Don't you dare," said Margaret, her voice coming out as a growl, grabbing the documents before Charles could reach them. She hugged the papers against her chest, looking at Charles with all the hatred she felt. "These documents are going to the authorities. They will finally expose you for what you really are," she said, each word loaded with determination. Charles looked at her with an expression that mixed anger and something that seemed like fear, realizing that he had completely lost control of the situation. "You can't prove anything, they're just old papers," he said, but his voice sounded weak and unconvincing. "You'll learn, Margaret. Messing with me was the biggest mistake of your life," he threatened, taking a step toward her. But before he could get any closer, the lawyer who had examined the documents earlier positioned himself between them, his posture protective. "Mr. Whitmore, I suggest you stop now before you do something you'll regret even more," said the lawyer, his voice firm and authoritative. "There are too many witnesses here, too much evidence, and there's a sick child who needs help," he continued, looking at Charles with clear disapproval. Charles looked around and saw that many of the guests were watching that interaction, many with expressions of disapproval, and realized that he couldn't do anything there without making his situation even worse. Margaret took advantage of that moment of distraction, quickly stored the documents in the bag, and ran to where the paramedics were taking Lily toward the exit. "Wait, I'm going with her," called Margaret, reaching the stretcher, taking Lily's hand, who was semi-conscious, her eyes open but glazed. "Mother is here, my daughter. I'll always be here," whispered Margaret, squeezing Lily's small, warm hand. They left the luxurious hall into the cold night air, and Margaret took a deep breath for the first time in hours, feeling the weight of that horrible place being lifted from her shoulders. The ambulance was parked in the circular driveway, its red and blue lights spinning and illuminating the mansion's facade in colors that seemed apocalyptic. The paramedics put the stretcher inside the ambulance with quick and precise movements, and Margaret climbed in after them, never letting go of Lily's hand. The doctor also got in, as he had promised, sitting on the other side of the stretcher. "We're going to Central Hospital. It has the best pediatric department in the city," informed the female paramedic, closing the ambulance doors. Margaret nodded, not caring where they were going as long as they could help Lily. The siren began to sound loud and urgent, and the ambulance began to move, getting away from that cursed mansion. Margaret looked through the small window and saw the mansion getting smaller and smaller, saw some guests standing at the entrance watching the ambulance leave, and felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger for what they had suffered, relief for finally leaving that place, fear for Lily's condition, but also a small spark of hope. "She will be fine, ma'am," said the doctor, noticing the expression of panic on Margaret's face. "The hospital will start treatment immediately. She's in good hands," he continued, his calm and professional voice trying to reassure her. Margaret nodded, unable to speak, silent tears running down her face as she watched Lily lying on that stretcher, connected to monitors that beeped regularly, measuring her heart, her oxygenation, keeping her alive. "I shouldn't have taken her there," Margaret said suddenly, guilt crushing her. "I knew it would be bad, knew we would be humiliated, but I took her anyway because I was desperate," she confessed, her voice breaking. "What kind of mother does this to her own daughter?" she asked, looking at the doctor with eyes full of self-accusation. The doctor shook his head firmly, leaning forward so Margaret could hear him better over the sound of the siren. "You are a mother who did the best she could in an impossible situation," he said with conviction. "You are a mother who protected her daughter, who fought for her, who loved her unconditionally even when everything was against you," he continued, his voice full of respect. "And thanks to the courage of both of you tonight, perhaps justice will finally be served," he added, and Margaret felt some of the weight of guilt diminish, though it didn't completely disappear. She looked at Lily again, caressing the girl's face with trembling fingers. "You were so brave, my daughter, so strong," whispered Margaret. "Stronger than I will ever be," she added, kissing Lily's hand. The ambulance sped through the city streets, the siren clearing a path through the night traffic, and Margaret watched the city lights passing by the window, thinking about how everything had changed in a single night. They had entered that mansion as objects of mockery and humiliation, but they had left with the truth finally revealed, with Robert's story finally told, with Charles's wickedness finally exposed. Of course, Margaret wasn't naive enough to think that this would resolve everything immediately. She knew that Charles was powerful and would have resources to fight, but for the first time in 2 years, she felt that there was a chance, a real possibility, that justice could be done. "Look at me, Lily," Margaret said softly, and Lily opened her eyes with effort, focusing on her mother's face with difficulty. "I love you more than anything in this world," said Margaret, her voice full of emotion. "And we will overcome this, we will be all right, I promise," she continued, making a promise that this time she believed she could keep. Lily tried to smile, just a small movement of her lips, but it was enough to make Margaret's heart overflow with love. "I love you too, Mum," whispered Lily so softly that Margaret could barely hear. But those words were like balm to her wounded soul. The paramedic checked the monitors again, adjusting the flow of oxygen that Lily was receiving through a mask, and Margaret saw concern in the woman's expression. "How long until we arrive?" asked Margaret, fear returning forcefully. 2 minutes, replied the paramedic. "Just 2 more minutes and she'll be receiving full treatment," she assured, and Margaret nodded, counting every second. The ambulance finally arrived at the hospital, stopping abruptly at the emergency entrance, where a medical team was already waiting, alerted by the paramedics via radio. The rear doors of the ambulance opened, and Lily was quickly removed, the stretcher being pushed toward the entrance while doctors and nurses surrounded it, asking questions, checking vital signs, working in perfect synchronization. Margaret ran alongside the stretcher, holding Lily's hand, refusing to let go even as they passed through the automatic doors into the hospital. "What's her name?" asked a nurse in a blue coat holding a clipboard. Lily Collins," Margaret quickly responded. 12 years old," she added before they could ask. "Do you have health insurance?" asked the nurse, and Margaret felt her stomach sink. "No, we don't, but please don't let that stop you from treating her," begged Margaret, her voice desperate. "I'll pay somehow, I'll do anything. But please help my daughter," she continued, tears running down her face. The doctor who had come with them in the ambulance quickly approached, putting his hand on the nurse's shoulder. "I'm taking responsibility for her treatment," he said with authority. "To do everything necessary, I guarantee the payment," he declared, and Margaret looked at that man with gratitude she had no words to express. The nurse nodded and continued making notes on the clipboard as everyone moved quickly down the corridor. They reached an emergency treatment room where Lily was transferred from the paramedic stretcher to a hospital bed. Doctors immediately began to work, placing an intravenous line in her arm, connecting her to more monitors, taking blood samples, preparing medications. Margaret stood in the corner of the room, watching everything with wide eyes, feeling completely useless and frightened. "Mom, I need you to answer some questions about Lily's medical history," said a nurse gently, guiding Margaret out of the room where the noise and activity were less intense. Margaret answered all the questions as best she could, explaining about the cough that had started almost a week ago, about the fever that came and went, about how they lived on the streets and didn't have regular access to proper food or warm shelter. The nurse wrote everything down without judgment, only with professional efficiency, and Margaret felt grateful for that. When they finished, the nurse took Margaret back near the room where Lily was being treated, but wouldn't let her enter. "The doctors need space to work," the nurse explained gently. "But you can wait here, and as soon as it's possible, we'll let you in," she assured her, pointing to some plastic chairs in the corridor. Margaret nodded and sat down heavily, feeling all the adrenaline that had kept her standing during the last few hours finally ebbing away, leaving only deep exhaustion and overwhelming fear. Margaret sat in that uncomfortable chair, watching doctors and nurses go in and out of the room where Lily was, and for the first time allowed herself to process everything that had happened in that impossible night. They had been invited to that party with the cruel purpose of being publicly humiliated, and they had indeed been humiliated in the most degrading way possible. But then something had changed. Lily had found courage that Margaret didn't even know the girl possessed, had taken that microphone and had told the truth to hundreds of people. And Margaret had shown the documents she had kept for so long, the evidence she always knew would one day be important. And together, mother and daughter had exposed Charles Whitmore for what he really was in front of his friends, his associates, his social elite. "We did it," Margaret whispered to herself, hardly able to believe it. "We really did it," she repeated, a hysterical laugh threatening to escape from her throat. Of course, she didn't know what would come next, didn't know if that revelation would have real consequences for Charles, or if he would manage to escape unscathed as powerful people so often do. But at least the truth had been told, the lie had been exposed, and Robert's memory had been honored. "I hope you saw that, Robert," said Margaret, looking upward as if her dead husband could hear her. "I hope you're proud of your daughter, of our brave girl," she continued, tears silently streaming down. "She is as strong as you were, has your lion heart," whispered Margaret, smiling through the tears as she remembered the husband she so loved and still loves. The doctor who had come with them in the ambulance came out of the treatment room and walked over to Margaret, his expression serious but not alarmed. Margaret stood up quickly, wiping the tears from her face, preparing herself to hear what he had to say. "Lily is stable," said the doctor, and Margaret felt her knees almost give way with relief. "The fever is starting to come down with the antipyretics, and we've started treatment with intravenous antibiotics," he continued, reporting the actions taken. "She has bacterial pneumonia, but we caught it in time," he explained. "With proper treatment and rest, she should recover completely," said the doctor, and Margaret felt as if a weight of 1,000 tons had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," repeated Margaret, taking the doctor's hands and squeezing them tightly. "Thank you for everything you did for us tonight," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "You saved my daughter. You were the only person in that horrible place who showed real humanity," she continued, tears of gratitude falling freely. The doctor squeezed Margaret's hands gently and then released them, smiling with kindness. "I only did what any decent person should do," he said with humility. "And as for the payment for the treatment, don't worry about that now," he added. "I'll take care of everything. You have enough worries," said the doctor, and Margaret felt her heart overflow with gratitude for that generous stranger. "How can I thank you?" asked Margaret, feeling completely inadequate to express what she felt. "Just take good care of your daughter and fight for the justice you deserve," he replied with a gentle smile. "Hello, my name is Dr. Benjamin Carter, and I'll be personally overseeing Lily's treatment," he said, formally extending his hand this time. Margaret shook his hand firmly, memorizing that name she would never forget. 3 months have passed since that terrible night at the mansion, 3 months that changed everything. Lily recovered completely from the pneumonia, spending 2 weeks in the hospital under the attentive care of Dr. Benjamin and his team. The video from that night had spread across social media like wildfire. Millions of people watching Lily's brave revelation and seeing the documents that proved Charles Whitmore's fraud. Public pressure was immense and instantaneous. Authorities had no choice but to investigate, and the judicial process was surprisingly quick due to the irrefutable evidence that Margaret had kept all those years. Charles Whitmore was convicted of fraud, embezzlement and document forgery, losing everything he had stolen and much more. Margaret and Lily received back 50% of the company that Robert had helped build, as well as $1 million compensation for moral damages that made up for, at least financially, the years of suffering on the streets. The first thing Margaret did with the money was to ensure that Lily received the best possible medical treatment, consultations with specialists, complete examinations, everything to ensure that the girl was completely healthy. They bought a cozy house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing too big or ostentatious, just a home full of light and warmth where they could rebuild their lives. Margaret used part of the compensation to open the Robert Collins Foundation, an organization dedicated to helping homeless families, offering temporary shelter, medical assistance, psychological support, and help finding employment. It was Margaret's way of honoring her husband's memory and transforming all the pain they had suffered into something positive that could help others going through the same difficulties. On that sunny spring morning, Margaret and Lily were in the garden of their new home, planting colorful flowers that would bring life and joy to that space that was now theirs. Lily was unrecognizable compared to that pale and sick girl from 3 months ago, now with rosy cheeks, bright eyes, and a radiant smile that lit up any environment. They worked side by side, their hands dirty with soil but their hearts light and happy. "We did it, Robert, we did it," Margaret whispered, looking at the blue sky, knowing that somehow he was watching. "Justice has been served, my love," she continued, smiling through tears of joy. Lily stood up, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at her mother with a serious and determined expression. "Mom, when I grow up, I'm going to study law to defend people like us," Lily said, her voice firm and full of purpose. "I'm going to make sure no one else goes through what we went through. I'm going to fight for justice for everyone who needs it," she continued, and Margaret felt her heart burst with pride. Margaret hugged her daughter tightly, feeling the warm sun shine on them like a blessing. "I know you will, my daughter. I know you will change the world," said Margaret, smiling genuinely for the first time in years. They stood there embracing in the garden of their home, surrounded by flowers that were beginning to bloom, under a cloudless blue sky, finally at peace, finally free, finally home. Now tell me in the comments where you're from, and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one that's waiting for you here on the screen. I'll see you there.